Record. Okay. Hi, I'm Edwin Rutch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and this is a dialogue we're going to have looking at an article entitled, Actually, we Don't Need More Empathy, and this is by the psychologist Daniel Goleman, and he explains why empathy alone rarely leads to action, proposes a simple mediation exercise to change that. And I'm here with Lou and Tom, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Lou Zweier. I'm from Northern California, and I'm a filmmaker and an educator. And I teach communication and conflict resolution. It's one of the things I teach.
And I'm Tom Atlee, founder of the Co-Intelligence Institute in Eugene, Oregon. And I'm interested primarily in how to bring wisdom to participatory, self-governing democratic processes.
And you've both worked on the theme of empathy, and have written, Tom, you've written about it, and even won an award for for your writing and work on empathy. So, and Lou and I have done a lot of work together too at the Empathy Tent and kind of other projects.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and empathy is a big component in good communication and conflict resolution and leadership, because that's another thing I teach is leadership. Good leaders use their understanding of themselves and others to help guide processes.
And so what we want to do here is use this article by Daniel Goleman, he's an author, it says here, psychologist and science journalist, and he was the person that popularized the concept of emotional intelligence. So he's, a spokesperson for that, has written for the New York Times and a lot of other magazines, and I think he's actually done a lot of work around empathy and leadership too, emotional intelligence and leadership. So we wanted to go through his article step by step and just discuss and to dialogue about it. And so I made some headings here, and we can start off with the first heading. Is he starts off the article basically by saying, he's saying that a lot of people are saying that the world needs more empathy, and that there's all these different problems out in the world, and he gives a couple of examples. One is diversity and inclusion, work that's going on, as well as he's also talking about the political divisions in the country, the world does need maybe more empathy. So any thoughts about that? I personally agree with it. The world, I agree. The world needs more empathy. My whole last 14 years has been on that topic, saying, hey, we need a culture of empathy. So
yeah, I mean, my perspective on that is, what I see and hear a lot is what I would call a culture of blame. And kind of accusation. So, whether it's in the news or other places, mostly in the news media, I guess, because when I think about what am I talking about when I say this is what I see and hear, I mean, I see it and hear it some in interactions that I actually observe between people myself, but mostly I'm actually, I guess, responding to things I see in the media that I read or see, which is always looking for what's wrong and who's to blame for it, and a kind of win-lose, right-wrong lens, that everything is looked at through that lens. I don't see much gratitude, and I don't see much appreciation or attempt for understanding. I mostly see blaming and accusation, and
so that's the problem that you're seeing.
Well, when he's saying we need more empathy, I think that's part of what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from a collective wisdom perspective, my way of defining wisdom is taking into account what needs to be taken into account for long-term broad benefit, And empathy is a way of accessing what somebody is thinking and feeling, and what their needs are, how they fit into the larger picture. So if we are not able to listen, if we are not able to resonate with where another person or group or whatever is at, we are missing a big piece of the picture that is needed to take into account if we want to really cover the ground. So for me, that's a large functional reason for empathy, aside from just it makes for good human relations. If we really want to understand the larger whole that we're dealing with, we need to have empathy in order to do that.
So is that saying empathy is a way of looking at finding the problems, being aware of problems? Is that
and of solutions? And it's not just problems, it's like perspectives, multiple perspectives. It's like being able to have the two eyes and see through, you get your 3D by being able to see through two different eyes. The more different perspectives you can include and handle well in your contemplation of things, the more you're going to see that you can then address and come up with good solutions. Anything that you don't attend to, that you don't include in your thinking about where we're at, is something that's going to come back and haunt you later, because it is part of the problem. Are you actually paying attention or not? So those things which we don't pay attention to come back and bite us later. So the more we can actually embrace, and embrace includes empathy, actually being able to welcome it into our space, digest it, do something creative with it.
So the empathy, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, just that the empathy then is hearing all those different voices and all those different perspectives. And when we hear those, when we hear them when we all hear each other's perspectives, we have better solutions then that we can create. That's kind of what I was hearing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to what I said before, which is that empathy means also hearing and understanding the pain that people are feeling. So I didn't mean in what I was saying before about negative, all the negative energy there. I mean, there is a lot of legitimate, pain out there. People are suffering, and empathy means having understanding for that suffering on all the way around, suffering from all quarters. And so I think it's important to understand people's pain, and I think it's also important to understand the sources of that pain. That's how solutions. Yeah. That's how we get to solutions, by understanding that.
And then you mentioned blame, and later on in the article, he's going to be talking about blocks to empathy. So that might be a good point to even come back to that. Blame as well as
right, and I think one of the aspects of blame is that it shifts the focus from what are the needs that people have and what is the pain that people are experiencing because their needs are not being met, and what might we do about that. The blaming kind of shifts the focus off of that, which is really where the solutions are. It shifts it to something else.
There's another dimension, which is the feeling heard aspect. A lot of the empathic practices involve really hearing somebody. And when somebody is fully heard, which is a very unusual experience for most people, there's a kind of psychological, spiritual, whatever, opening, a relaxation of them, and their ability to participate creatively in whatever happens next is greatly enhanced by that renewed openness and relaxation. There's not a fight or flight kind of response being generated. So that's another aspect, both for human relationships and for generating wisdom together and for solving problems, that kind of openness.
Okay, so the next point Daniel Goleman makes is what I'm hearing here in this section. He has concerns. He has concerns that the first one is that empathy does not necessarily lead to action, and also the rhetoric that there's a need for more empathy doesn't lead to action. So there's all these authors out there saying we need more empathy, and he's saying all that rhetoric about needing more empathy isn't leading to action. And then he's also saying that action is important to him, and he feels that it's caring that leads to action. And then he says there's practices are needed for that. So that's kind of the second kind of the paragraph or so is kind of his reading there. So any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I would agree that rhetoric that says we need more empathy isn't the same as actually providing more empathy. And I think recognizing that more is needed is great, but people's ability to provide it is, not automatic. People need some training. It's more like relearning, because empathy is kind of a natural response. But I think that people are often not in an empathic stance because they are in a lot of pain, because they're suffering in one way or another, because they need to be heard. Often the worst conflicts that I've seen is when two people really need to be heard and neither really has the space to listen. They both need empathy from each other and neither one can give it. And that's when you kind of have the worst arguments, and when you often need maybe a third person to help. I think that the question about whether empathy leads to action, I think in the article he's saying, kind of in an academic way, that he's defining those two things as separate. For me personally, I don't know that I would separate caring and empathy. I think listening empathically is a form of caring. But I think of it as an action too. I'm doing something, but whether listening to someone causes me to actually do something for them, like say, so would you like me to, would you like a hug, or would you like me to, help you solve the problem that you are talking about? That's an interesting question, because sometimes people don't want problem solving, they just want to be heard. So that's something that I'm careful to do when I'm listening, is not necessarily cross over into problem solving without asking them, would you like to be heard? Or a lot of times spontaneously, if someone actually is heard and they do need help solving the problem, then they'll ask. So I'm wondering if you have any opinions about this, or do you have any suggestions for me? Or, I see that will happen spontaneously. But I agree it's probably possible to have empathy for someone and not be moved to take any other action. I think it depends on how I view that. My relationship to that person might be dependent on that.
I think he is oversimplifying something and using particular definitions of words that make his point. But to sort of connect up with what Lou is saying, and as a point of critiquing Goleman's response, you could say, well, the fact that people fight with each other comes from their caring. They really care about their particular perspective, and they don't have empathy, but they have caring. And so caring is not enough. There's all this caring. You're asking for caring, Mr. Goleman. Well, what about empathy? So there's a sense, how does the caring manifest, and what is the nature of the action? He says there's not action based on your caring. So there's a way in which we want caring, empathic action, including systemic caring and action. I mean, it's like there are many pieces of this puzzle, and to start to notice, I mean, he is negating one part of what's needed on behalf of serving another part of what's needed, which is usually what's going on in battles between people, is each person has a piece of what's true and important, and they are pushing their piece opposing other pieces rather than being in a shared inquiry about what's the larger whole, what's the bigger truth that we could be involved in. And empathy, particularly trained empathy, like nonviolent communication, people who have skills at empathy, good listening, whatever, these things help people get in a space where they can be in shared inquiry about what really makes sense for them all. And so I could be more empathic for Mr. Goleman, but I'm just pointing out that his favoring action and caring as opposed to empathy is a little silly. Excuse me.
I also want to add, listening to what Tom said, and I think this is actually a really important point, is that, you know, the meaning of words, like what is caring, what does it mean to do something caring, is not fixed. So that word would have meaning, could have meaning in lots of different ways. So someone could think of just listening empathically as an act of caring, and even to stretch it to what Tom said, that just arguing, being in an argument shows that you are caring. And that's a framing, not many people would have that framing, but that's a framing that's possible, that if you're not arguing with me, and actually I have heard people say this, because these are people that come from cultures where they argue very vigorously in their family. And so if we're not having an argument about it, it means you don't care about this. Someone said about interrupting also, like in some cultures, it's, you know, you're showing respect by letting the person get to the end of what they're saying before you start talking. In other cultures, you're saying, I don't care about your idea if you're not cutting in with something. You know, you're going to wait till I'm done before you say something. Like, don't you care at all about what I'm saying? You know, otherwise you'd be jumping in here and talking. So, yeah, so there's a lot of meaning making that happens within the individual and within cultures around that.
And there's also, you mentioned the definition. What does caring mean? What does action mean? What is an action, and what is empathy? So there is questions about the meaning of each of these, and everyone has different meanings. And for me, for example, I get a little irritated about this thing that empathy is not action. There's certain communities that they go, you got to have compassion or whatever for action. You know, that empathy, that just kind of gets you there, but, you know, it's pretty useless besides that. And I see empathy, and I'm seeing it completely different, that empathy, offering empathy to someone, is perhaps one of the greatest acts of action that you can do, to really hear somebody deeply for what's going on for them, to empathize with them, is hugely, and that's, I think, Tom, what you were raising that previously, as well as, like, how does action happen? And I was recalling something I read by Carl Rogers in his work in the therapeutic world, like how action happens. For him, it was the action and change happen by hearing someone, and for someone seeing their world in a new way. Is they have a new insight or a new sense of self or awareness. And then from that new sense of awareness, they're actually going forward in life with that new sense, and all their actions and decisions are affected by that. So if somebody is very angry and you empathize with them, they're becoming calmer, and their actions going forth in their life, you know, from that point, are coming from a space of calmness, which is really having kind of ripple effects. So I guess I get a little irritated about that. Empathy is no action part. That's my response. Because there's a certain community that does that. It always bugs me that
and then there's the focus, the focus on action per se, which I understand where it's coming from. You know, it's like, are you actually going to have an impact? Or are you just doing this, you know, mental masturbation, whatever, emotional, blah, blah, blah. But the action, there's all different kinds of action. You know, what are the outcomes of your action? And the question about impact, as well as the questions about intention and meaning and all that. But there's action is a really complex term, and he's just going, action is this good thing. He hasn't defined what kind of action. And beating somebody over the head, killing people, these are actions too. Bombing Hiroshima was an action. Is that what he wants? It's like, let's get more nuance for all of these different terms and see how they all can serve life in the biggest form they possibly can in relationship to each other, rather than oversimplifying what it is that's needed, sort of unidimensional. There's a book called by Ram Dass and Richard Gorman called How Can I Help? That is a very sophisticated, it complexifies your thinking, filled with stories. It's an amazing book, looking at what help really is. And even what do they call it? The golden rule, do unto others, you would have them do unto you. Yes. That's all fine and good if they want the same things you want. But that's the importance of empathy, is we figure out what somebody else actually needs and wants to be able to actually do action that helps them.
Well, and isn't that the platinum rule? Do unto others as they would like you to do unto them.
Right.
Right, because what you would like might be different than what they would like.
Right.
And I do think, just to say one more thing about action. So I do think, certainly in nonviolent communication, there's empathy, which is the purpose of which is to understand the other and to make yourself understood. But then there's what, do you have a request? Is there some action that you would like taken beyond that, beyond being understood, that you would like the person to do? And I do think that, in terms of resolving conflict, understanding may be the only thing that a person is looking for, but often it's more than that. Understanding is the beginning of making a connection where shared problem solving can happen. But then in most cases, there is some shared problem solving that needs to happen, which means making a request or more than one, and taking some actions to help resolve a situation.
Well, another aspect of this that is not directly addressed by him, but is sort of a subtext, is it seems to me he's coming from an individualistic view of empathy, in that it's talking about this one person who is empathizing with others, versus seeing that it's a relationship. And that's how I was hearing, Lou, what you were saying, is that people are coming and saying, what action do we take together? Because people are in a relationship with each other. And it seems like there's a different way of framing this topic from sort of an individualistic view. Just what is this individual doing, to others or in relation to others, versus what is the shared relationship, shared quality of the relationship. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's a little bit of what Tom is getting at. Is
there's also a bigger thing, which is it's an expansion. Excuse me, my partner is singing to herself. There's a issue like the story of teaching, giving somebody a fish versus teaching them the fish. There's a difference between helping the homeless person and questioning, as Martin Luther King says, the social structures that generate homelessness, that generate poverty, the kinds of attention that goes to people who are affected by hurricanes. We just had these hurricanes and fires recently, and the level of attention that can be put, and you're really feeling compassion, empathy for these people and wanting to do massive amounts of money and energy go into helping those people, compared to the amount of money and energy that's going to dealing with climate change, which is the cause of all this. It's gigantic compared to the amount that's going to the systemic causes. So that's a whole other dimension of expanding empathy beyond the individuals who are hurting to the systemic and cultural causes of that hurt. And so that's part of my issue with what kind of action is appropriate, and having the empathic feelings, even the spiritually informed loving kindness things don't necessarily open you up to engagement with the systemic causes. So for me, the big empathy includes addressing systemic causes, includes embedding empathic results into the way the systems are structured in the first place. So having a political system, for example, a governance system, which really hears all voices, that's an example of embedding empathy into the system. And there are ways to do that. So those are other things that take it beyond the individual or the relational capacities.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, and that's beautifully articulated. I easily make that transition, and I'm not sure that a lot of people do, but I easily see it's the same impulse impulse of responding to somebody who is behaving in a way that I don't like. So rather than responding to them with like judgment or like what's wrong with you analysis, responding to them with thinking empathically, oh, what's going on in that person that they're behaving this way? What kind of pain are they experiencing? Or like, what are they after? What basic human need are they trying to meet by doing this? Are they looking for sustenance? Are they looking for safety? Are they looking for respect? Are they, something like that? And what I move to easily from that is, so what kind of system do we have? What kind of culture or society do we have that produces a person that is in this situation, that is in this kind of pain? That seems like a natural question to ask, rather than sort of blaming the individual for, well, there must be something wrong with you. Everything else is okay, and there must be something wrong with you. That's why this is happening. As opposed to seeing the human struggling and saying, why are you struggling like that? Why do we produce so many people that struggle so much? And how could we change things so that people's needs are met and not so many people are going around struggling all over the place?
Yeah, that's the culture of empathy. That's how I'm seeing empathy, is in that larger context, and that actually leads into the next part of his article. It's really he's called it the limits of empathy, or maybe the blocks to empathy. And first he says stress inhibits empathy, and he uses a Good Samaritan test, which I've heard quite often in different academic circles of some seminary students who are given the task of giving a talk on the Good Samaritan. They go from walk to one building to the other where they're supposed to give their presentation. It's set up so that they're late, and then there's a homeless person or someone in distress kind of on the way. And do they walk past that person, or do they stop and help them? And the idea being is that the stress, so their time limit, stress, had most of them walk past. So that was, and then the other one was self-absorption. Somehow, if you're very self-absorbed, I guess that's maybe narcissism or something. He doesn't mention that, but very self-absorbed people, it will block empathy. And he also, this is another part that is empathy is largely passive and internally experienced, is he's saying, I think. But the point he goes into, if you feel another person's pain, it will block your empathy. So you feel someone else's pain, it becomes too much for you, and that blocks your empathy. So he's kind of going into these notions of there's two different sides of this. It's like, what is blocking empathy? And this is a block, this is a limit of empathy. And I think this ties into, Lou, the couple of points you've made about, it's almost like saying the pain could be a block to empathy, blame, and judgment. So it's kind of this whole constellation of what is blocking or limiting empathy. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was thinking, there's a variety of thoughts. One of them is the nurses and doctors in urgent care or military hospitals, where the amount of pain that they see, the amount of pain and potential damage that's part of their job to bring about or cause, that there's a limit to how much they can feel that and still continue their jobs. So that's one of the things that comes up in support of what he's saying. But there are so many other limits, and it feels like there's up to a point. Empathy is a very powerful motivator. So he seems to be ignoring that and ignoring the issue of how much capacity does an individual or a group have to feel and act. And there's lots of stuff going on in that question of capacity. And how do you increase that capacity? Nonviolent communication, things like that, are ways to increase that capacity where you don't have to get overwhelmed because you have the support of this way of engaging that has a certain logic to it. And his thing of stress and going, what if the people who are on their way to give their talk, their sermon, are actually not stressed? They are feeling they can have a better impact on the world by giving the sermon than by helping this one person. And that's what's going on in their universe. So the assumption that they are stressed and that's what's going on, they've created this conflict between two things. They may be making a moral choice. He is presuming stress is the cause. And I go, I don't know if that's true. We know all the examples.
Yeah, so I agree that stress and strong emotion tends to block empathic connection, because if I've got a lot going on in me, particularly if the stimulus for what's going on in me is what I'm seeing in front of me, then it's hard to make that connection. I think that I actually did have a personal experience not too long ago of being approached by someone in a parking lot. I was coming out of the market, and a guy who said, I'm here. It was late at night, and he said, I'm here and I have no money and I have no place to stay, and so I gave him some money. And part of me wanted to know more about him, not just give him money, but say, so what's going on with you that you're standing out here? How did you get yourself into this situation that you're standing out here with no place to stay and no money, and it's nighttime? And but it was late at night and I was tired, and I kind of didn't really have the internal resources to want to do that. So I didn't. I gave him some money and I went on. But I think, and I think the framing, Tom, that you just suggested, that, you could have another framing of what actually is going on with someone that makes that decision, which is that they have a larger mission that they're on, that they think is that they are confident is going to make a contribution. And so they're making a choice, am I going to spend my time doing this, helping this one person, or doing this larger thing? So I think that it's difficult to know what's going on inside a person, and there isn't just one reason why people might do a particular thing. I also think there's one other point that I want to make, which is that, so I do a lot of, in the leadership training that I do a lot of emotional work with people where, they are working through pain that they are either currently experiencing or they experienced in the past, as a way of like doing some healing and growing their own awareness about why they behave the way they do or why they react to situations the way they do. And some people who do that kind of work experience that work as exhausting, and I don't. I experience it as exhilarating. And I think part of it is because of the framing that I understand the healing that's happening, and I understand the increased capacity that's going to come from it. So it has a lot of meaning to me to be doing it, and it's exciting because I know I'm contributing to something. I think others experience more maybe stimulation of their own internal pain. So while they're working with the person, they are also working with their own internal struggle. And because of that, it's like, it's really wears them out, and they experience it as difficult work. And so I think that's an element too in empathy is, what is your reaction to being in the presence of the strong emotions of other people? That has an impact on how available are you for empathy, how much available empathy is there in the world, for people to offer one to another. And if we had more of a culture of empathy and people had more healing and were heard more and were healthier, they probably would be able to listen more to others, and there would be more capacity for that.
Yeah, I think this comes again to the framing between an individualistic and a cultural empathy or relational empathy. This is seen as you as an individual, you're gathering this pain, seeing this pain, you're not able to deal with it, so you're shutting down your empathy. So it's, in a sense, it's saying empathy with others is leading to a block in your empathy. So in a sense, empathy is leading to empathy. And I would say there's steps in between there. It's more like it's not knowing how to deal with that pain or having, it's basically what you're saying. Lou, is if you have this capacity, actually it might be no problem being around that pain. And I've heard that a lot of, in palliative care, there's a lot of people who are really good at palliative care. They're around people that are dying, just they are very present and they're able to kind of hold that. And I've just heard that. So that's kind of one component of it. The other is seeing that from an individualistic way. It's like me getting overwhelmed, but we're in a relationship. So if someone is becoming overwhelmed, it's like that they're in need of empathy themselves. So it's not that they had too much empathy. Is it within the relationship, within the culture of relationship, there's an empathy deficit. So, but if you look at it from a relational point of view, so it really depends again on that perspective, on this kind of individual me as the center and what's happening for me. Then it could seem like, well, reaching out to all these people is overwhelming. Or if you look at it in a relational way, I'm part of this relationship. Hey, I'm needing to reach out to my friends to get more empathy for me, because there's an empathy deficit basically within the relationship. So
there's an expansion of that, and it links to this care versus empathy dichotomy that he's presented. I think of Joanna Macy's work with she used to do work with despair and empowerment, people who were overwhelmed by the prospect of nuclear war, and their manifestation in the society was of apathy. They weren't active. They weren't doing anything about it. It seemed like they didn't care. And she tracked that to the pain they were feeling, the despair about, here is this giant problem that is there and its potential to destroy everything they care about. The fact that they're so despairing is because they care so much. And their despair makes it so that they don't act. And her despair and empowerment work was getting together in groups. And it fits with what you're saying, Edwin, about shared empathy. In the groups, they hear each other's pain and despair and caring, and collectively release the blockage that creates on their ability to act, and then they act together to make some kind of difference on that issue. So it's a much more complex and juicy and filled with potential framing than the kind of framing he's saying, that what we need is not empathy but care, and caring is about caring for an individual. This is a much more holistic kind of perspective.
There's also an element of Marshall Rosenberg talks about emergency first aid self-empathy. So, and this is empathy you can give yourself. And I certainly do that. I'm in a difficult moment and I breathe, I use breathing to help calm myself. And I use just recognizing internally, boy, I could use more understanding right now, or boy, I could use more connection or compassion, or whatever I'm needing in the moment, acknowledgement, appreciation. Those are things that I'm often feeling when when I'm having difficulty staying present and having empathy for someone else. Those are usually the things I'm needing for myself, and so I try to give it to myself so that I can come back and be more present. So that's another form of empathy we haven't really talked about, and he doesn't really talk about in the article at all. And I think Rosenberg calls it emergency first aid empathy because, like you said, we are social animals, and I think it is sort of natural or normal to have that empathy and understanding come from around us. But it's also very powerful to, recognize that you have that capacity inside you too, and not always be reliant on people outside yourself for understanding, because you can't provide that to yourself too.
He did include that in the loving kindness meditation as part of his loving kindness meditation.
That's true.
Yeah, that takes us into the empathy building practices. So he is, Daniel Goleman is saying, it's good to have practices, and the one practice is a loving kindness meditation, or metta, I think it's called as well. And so we're kind of coming to this point. It's like, how do you practice empathy? And, we've mentioned social empathy, which I addressed, and then there's self-empathy, which you've been talking about, Lou, and then learning more self-empathy skills. And then I was hearing Tom sort of being active I'm not quite sure if that was quite an empathy building practice, but it was in terms of if you go into despair, having kind of action can get you out of it. But the main point here he's making is loving kindness meditation. And I know, Lou, you said you'd actually done it. I've done a very tiny bit of it, so I'm not real practiced at it. You have any comments on that?
Well, in the leadership training that we do, that is one of the things that we teach is the loving kindness meditation, which is, it's very old. It's a Buddhist meditation. It's been around for a very long time. And it works, I mean, if you sit and you say that to yourself as a practice, and if you're having a problem with a particular person and you put them in the meditation, it will shift how you feel.
Can you explain how that process works? Like, how does that?
I mean, I think he in the article, he says the meditation, it starts with self, and then others, and then the world. Eventually, it works its way self out from, and it says, I'm freezing up now. I can't remember the wording. I have to look at the article, but basically, it says, I want love and kindness for myself. That's what I hope for myself. That's what I want for myself. I want love and kindness for the person, the person that I'm thinking of, or my community, or my family, and then the world.
Is it that you think of a person that you have that love and kindness with, and then you think of them, and then you try to direct that to others?
No, you could. I mean, I suppose if you weren't feeling, actually, I think, you're just saying that that's what you want. That's what you hope for. And, that is your desire, is to have that for yourself and for others to experience it. And if you're thinking about a particular person, if you're using the meditation to shift your feelings and thinking about a particular person, you put them in there and you say that's what you want for them. And I think it calls on our natural human desire for those things, and shifts one out of the kind of right, wrong, blaming thinking, like, oh, what this person did was wrong, and oh, they deserve whatever. It shifts out of that thinking into more compassionate, loving, kindness thinking.
I sort of was realizing just now the pray for them that abuse you kind of thing from Christianity. I think it's in the Sermon on the Mount, that has a similar kind of function. although it has been used as a thing to support, abuse, slavery, stuff like that. The slaveholders say, "Pray for us." Get the good Christian slaves to pray for us and excuse us, whatever. But I just realized that at a very spiritual level and a social level, that pray for those that abuse you is very similar to the loving kindness thing in terms of the kind of reorientation of your psychology and spirit, your thinking towards another.
Yeah, and I think that idea of praying for the slave owners or whatever, I mean, I think the idea of that is a recognition that doing things that harm another person also harms the person who is doing it. And so you're kind of praying for their soul, that they will wake up to the harm that they're doing to themselves and that they'll find a way to free themselves from it. Because I think it's true that, when a person does harm to another person, there's a part of them that knows that, that's happening. And that's not our basic human nature to do that.
The idea of fight the oppression and love the oppressor.
Yeah.
The act is the act is your real issue.
Yes.
Being.
And Rosenberg would say the oppressive act is a failed strategy to try to meet some important need. So see the need, resist the strategy, but see the need and try to reach out to the person and try to find another way for them to meet the need that's not so harmful. Yeah.
So is the meta meditation like trying to see the need for care everywhere? Is that I'm not that familiar. I've done the practice and just very short, not in depth. So I'm not well versed. I'm not clear on it.
So there's not a lot of intellectualization to it. It's really just calling for love and kindness. It's calling on oneself to offer that to others, to yourself, and then to others. And by calling yourself to do it, it puts you in a different space.
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't been real familiar with it because I just don't see it working in myself very well. It's like, I'm sorry. It's like I know you can pray for me and direct that loving kindness towards me would be great because there's this whole compassion community that this seems to be a core practice and it just hasn't worked for me yet. So I've always found, in terms of practices, I found the empathic listening, active listening as a tool, like a better tool for one, like if we're talking about practices, as well as kind of the worldview or the way of seeing the deeper, the feelings someone has, an awareness of the felt experience and the feelings and desires that they might have or the needs. So those are some kind of practices and approaches that have worked, better for me.
It's interesting. I was thinking of in Hinduism, there's like these 7 in yoga. There's 7 different kinds of yoga for different kinds of personalities. The yoga of action, the yoga of knowledge, the yoga of meditation, contemplation, whatever. And it occurs to me that the practice of empathy may have different threads, different tracks of practice that are acknowledged to be appropriate for different personalities. Some people want to combine them or other, but you say, if you're like this, then this might be what's best for you. I've never seen anybody analyze it in that way, but it may be very appropriate to somebody to do that.
That strikes me as having some truth in it. And it's reminding me that I learned from Mickey Kashdan a process of using gesture as a way of working through kind of an empathic thing where, there's no words. You don't use words, you use gestures. And, for people who are kinetic, and actually for everyone, because we all gestures have meaning for everyone. And it's a very interesting nonverbal way of working through something rather than using words. I found it to be very powerful.
Hugs.
Yeah.
Hugs.
Hugs.
And of course, there's the archetypal non-empathic gesture. Anyway.
Well, there is another approach. There's a book by Alan Alda where he talks about communication and empathy, and he's using the practices that come out of acting improv. And there's one activity which he really likes is where you mirror the other person physically. So you're doing whatever, suddenly everybody's moving their heads, nodding, but one person is leading. So everybody's following the other person. And then you switch and, consciously, okay, now you're leading and you're doing whatever emotions there are. And you kind of go back and forth for a while. And then you say, no one's leading. And then you kind of move into it, almost this third space, this kind of this magical space for him. It's highly empathic, highly connected. And you're moving in sync, but it's almost like you're moving in sync together. So it's a highly just bodily felt experience. So that's some other practice. So, well, that was pretty much the essence of the article I think we went through. So is there more, anything that we might have missed within the article?
I wanted to ask you one thing, Edwin, about what you said about, say, the loving kindness meditation not working for you. So are you saying you've tried it and it doesn't really help you?
Yeah, it's like if I'm in the middle of a conflict, I just, trying to think of the love of my mother. I'm sorry. It's like, it's like, it's like there's something I just don't want to sit there with that. It's like,
well, I've never used it in the moment. So
okay.
Kind of thing where, when I'm not in the conflict, I'm outside of the conflict, I'm reflecting on what to do about it, or trying to think of doing some process to help me shift some of my internal, how I'm responding to that person or that situation. And then doing the loving kindness meditation might have an effect on that. So if I do that for a while and I sit with it for maybe, 10 or 15 minutes and I'm just doing that, doing the meditation, then the next time I go talk to that person, I might have a different response than I had in the past. That's how I use it. And then the other question I wanted to ask you was, so do you have success using self-empathy in the moment if you're having difficulty?
I'm aware of the self-empathy. I think I like the kinetic, the felt experience. I used to do contact improv dance. So all these different exercises for, physical connection outside of words. Sometimes all the words can be too much, so I can value the most felt experience. And I do try, I would like to get better at the self-empathy. And I do find that just having someone there to listen kind of makes it less of a self, it takes away some of the edge of maybe aloneness or something, because if I'm just doing it on my own. But there is, so I'm not really quite sure as how, I can see a lot more that I could do with self-empathy, and I've thought a lot about it. But
because I have worked with people who have a framing that empathy and understanding have to come from outside.
Oh, yeah.
It has to come from other people, or else it doesn't really have any meaning. And they don't, and it takes them, and it's a surprise to them that they can actually provide it to themselves. They're just not in the habit of doing that. They never thought actually of that. And their framing was, if it doesn't come from someone else, then it doesn't really have much meaning.
Oh, no, I don't have that sense. No. But,
okay. All right.
But there's a reverse of that too, is it's all got to come from you.
Yes.
Too. I hear that all the time. It's like whatever is going on in the world, it doesn't matter. You've got to have your own self-awareness, it's almost like your own self-empathy in it. And yeah, I guess it's sort of I would say for me, it's more relational. I can't really just see, I just see that we're wired for connection, biologically, physiologically wired for that connection. And, having self-empathy, feeling into like what's coming up, like as we were talking here, I did want to share, I have frustration with the community that some of this stuff is coming from that Daniel Goleman is writing about. this comes from a book I think he did with David Ritchie, who has a Center for Compassion, and he's friends with, they're like connected with the whole compassion community. And I feel like, and the writings of that group is sort of critical, attacking on empathy, saying empathy, you know, that's, you need it to get things started, but it's really compassion that's important. And they have actual studies where the studies are just like a mess, really. And this is like top German academics. They've done these studies. It's kind of like, I mean, I'm exaggerating here, because so this is kind of going an extended explanation. Sorry about this, but it's kind of like the study is: poke yourself in the eye, feel that pain. Let's call that empathy. Now, you know, feel the pain of someone else. Now think of your mother's, the love of your mother. Now, doesn't that feel, that's compassion? Feeling the pain of your, you know, poking yourself in the eye, let's call that empathy. So it's some kind of like crazy stuff. And this is like, you know, I don't know, I'm all frustrated. So the frustration is about, I'm saying, yes, let me feel into that frustration, right? It's like, what do I need? You know, underneath that frustration is like, you know, I have a sense I need to be heard. I need kind of like openness, and, you know, and so that's kind of like that self-empathy. So I do try for that. I do have some of that frustration and that sense of irritation with that group of academics, which I see Daniel Goleman is part of. So that was long-winded.
There's a number of things that come up from that. One is a very funny video that has this couple, and the woman has a nail in her forehead. Have you seen this video?
I have.
I think I get it already. It sounds quite good.
And the guy is trying to tell her she's got a nail in her forehead. She has splitting headaches, and she's going, "You're trying to solve it, you know. I just want to be heard, you know." And so he tries to hear her, and it gets to a point where he just has to say it again. You know, she hits her head against. It's so painful. Ouch! He's sitting there. It's a very hilarious video. It's totally one-sided, but it's very funny presentation of that side. Some of the other relational exercises I've thought of. There's an exercise of somebody tells a story from their personal life to another person, and that other person tells the story back to the original person in the first person, as if it was their own story. Mm-hmm. And that's a really interesting exercise, to really step into the other person's shoes enough to say it with I, you know, instead of you, whatever, or telling it to other people in terms of you. And there's a thing called Story Bridge that uses this as a key piece of their exercise. Another is, it's like 25 questions or something, where they've done these experiments that if these two people who are total strangers answer these personal questions to each other, and then spend 3 minutes or something looking at each other's eyes, they fall in love. You know, it's almost guaranteed, whoever they are. It's just like, so those are interesting empathic twists from the relational world that you're talking about, Edwin. And a more generic thing I've carried around with me for a long time, Aldous Huxley, who did Brave New World, this is famous dystopia, he also did a positive utopia called Island. Oh. And on Island, there is this mix of Buddhism and science, and he says at one point through one of the characters that 2/3 of the suffering in the world is totally preventable, and for that we have science, and 1/3 of it is totally intrinsic to being a human being in the world, and for that we have Buddhism, you know. And I was feeling like empathy plays a role in that dance. And your self-empathy also is the Buddhist practice. You know, there's something about that 2/3, 1/3, and the preventable and intrinsic that I find useful in my own thinking about this. And there's something about empathy. Empathy can address, just by the act of empathy, like in nonviolent communication, there is a level of sharedness of the suffering, which is similar to the Buddhist 1/3. And then let's see if we can figure out some other strategy to handle that need. which is more like the 2/3. Let's actually do something in the real world. And recognizing that a big part of the suffering of the world, I say politics and governance is another form of like science. It's like politics and governance is generating all sorts of crap. So if we would actually address that, that would handle 2/3 of the suffering. But that dance between that 1/3 and 2/3, I find very useful in my own thinking about this. And again, I think Daniel Goleman is a great advocate for a particular perspective that is part of what is important to understand. And his fatal flaw, like the fatal flaw of every partisan viewpoint, is that it's only a part.
Right.
We don't have a word like holism, which is very interesting. We do have partisan, but we don't have holism.
Well, that's maybe, no, is there?
Go ahead.
Oh, I thought maybe this might be a time to close.
You have something I want to say.
Okay, before we close, then sure.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm totally with you, Tom, on that life is a dance, and that everything, and I think of it as balance too. You know, so the point that Edwin was making about external empathy offered by others versus empathy I offered myself. Both are valuable. Both are needed for a healthy, functioning society and person. You know, the power, there's a certain kind of power in self-empathy, which is that I can comfort myself and I can give myself understanding. I don't have to have somebody else. There's power in that, you know. And yet, if that's all you ever do, then you've kind of cut yourself off from other people and made yourself an island. And it's like, I don't need you. I'm completely self-contained, you know, and I don't need anyone else. Neither one of those is good. It's a balance, and each is a piece, as you're saying. And I think I think we need so much more of that, recognizing that systems and people and the world and problems are complex, and that's why diversity is important. That's why, you know, multiple perspectives is important, because like you said, each perspective holds some of the truth, and by holding all of it, we can, you know, figure out how to meet more people's needs, have a world that meets more people's needs. So I'm totally with you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Mirror that. Yeah, so this was a lot of fun, using this article as a gateway to having that discussion from multiple viewpoints. And so thanks for taking part, and maybe we'll be doing a couple more of these going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that.